Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm here today with Ali Ahmed, who is the founder of Green Strategies. We're going to talk about carbon. Ali, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Will. Good to be here.
All right. So we have an hour, Ali. I hope that you can get me smart about this. You hear a lot about, carbon markets and carbon offsets and so forth, but you've told me before that there's just a lot of different products related to that. And you do a lot of consulting around this. Maybe just to help orient us and kind of know where you're coming from, just give us sort of just a 1-minute overview on your firm and your areas of expertise.
Yeah, well, I work primarily with companies that have kind of seen the issues around environmental sustainability and their carbon emissions and help them formulate strategies and then get down into the tactical projects that they might go through to help reduce their emissions or to help them create these credits and move into credit marketplaces.
Okay. So give me an overview right now around what's going on with carbon credits and where do they come from? What are they? Do companies buy them? Is there trading
Yeah.
on it? Just give me an overview of this whole market.
Yeah, and it is a very, very complicated collection of markets, collection of global markets, really. But it all comes down to activities that are being done which either reduce the amount of carbon emissions associated with energy production or a specific manufacturing or other type of activity, or, and this is a more recent component, they're associated with actually projects which take carbon out of the air. So, there's a lot of talk about things like carbon sequestration and things like that. So they really evolve around these two project areas. Probably the simplest kind of credit that people can think about is those associated with things like wind turbines and solar panels. But there's a lot of other ways to generate these credits, including agriculture, including energy efficiency projects, including really esoteric things like changing the type of refrigerant coolant that you use in your air conditioning systems.
All right.
So there's a lot of different project potentials out there, and a lot of different markets spread across the globe for people to look at as they kind of try to understand what's best for them.
So let's start with the buyers. So who is buying carbon credits and who is requiring them to buy it? And maybe we focus on the United States for the minute. And is
Yeah.
it different across the United States? Is it different across industries? I mean, you hear politicians talking about, oh, we need to put a price on carbon. So it doesn't
Right.
seem like, just for me as a layperson, that it's even required for anybody to buy them, but people are apparently buying them. So explain to me, who are the buyers? Why are they buying these? What's requiring them to do it?
Yeah, and there are kind of two broad categories of markets. There's a voluntary market, and it is what it is. It's people who are voluntarily going into that marketplace, and they enter that space because they have some type of demand from their stakeholders, either end customers or B2B customers who are requiring them to do something about their emissions. And then there are regulated markets, and there are different regulated markets. They tend to be state by state across the United States. Probably the most active one right now is in California. But a lot of states have developed what they call renewable portfolio standards. So specific to renewable energy, there are requirements that typically apply to utility companies that have been forcing them for a number of years to buy more renewable energy and put more renewable energy in their portfolio. And that's one type of carbon credit is one associated with renewable energy.
So a state will require the utilities that supply energy in its state to have some percentage of their energy be from renewable.
Correct.
And
Correct.
if they don't, then they can get by basically just, so even if they're supplying electricity that comes just from a coal plant, they could go and buy these credits from someone else.
Correct. And it creates these markets. Probably the most popular one right now is in New Jersey, where they have a regulated market. And that market actually distinguishes for the utilities the difference between solar produced credits and wind produced credits. And it actually has created a market anomaly. The solar credits are trading for in excess of $200 a megawatt hour. So a credit is based on the amount of electricity in this case. So $200 a megawatt hour. And just to give you some idea, a kind of a national U.S. Mixed source credit, you can buy somewhere between 50 cents and $1 a megawatt hour. Wow. So that's a 200 to 400% multiplier on credit prices. And so it's created a huge market for solar in New Jersey. The electricians unions are loving it. They are racked solid putting solar on every single flat roof in New Jersey, and have been for a number of years.
So beyond utilities, then what other types? So in that case, they're required to do it. So the state requires the utility to buy it, so they have to go buy renewable. What other sorts of companies would be buying carbon credits on the regulated or the voluntary markets?
Right. So, I mean, there's obviously a lot of movement towards improved sustainability, within the Fortune 500 ranks. Have signed up to reduce their carbon emissions. And there's a variety of, alphabet soup organizations they report to. One most notably is called CDP, which used to stand for the Carbon Disclosure Project. Now they just go by CDP. But they actually publish, a report and give grades to companies. And they then supply those reports to the investor community. So companies participate in that reporting scheme because they want to have positive looking numbers on their Bloomberg screens where CDP puts those numbers. So I think that's been a big driver kind of in the Fortune 500 world. And typically, if you look at the various offset markets in the US for sure, and even globally when you go out to Europe, they are dominated still by the Fortune 500. They're the primary companies. We're seeing too is as these standards get more strict, companies are looking down their supply chain, their value chains, and the standards are starting to require them to do things about the carbon across their value chain. So they can't simply just outsource the carbon problem to another part of their value chain. And so now we're seeing the larger companies start to require, at a minimum, reporting, but it's starting to see them actually require reductions across their value chain. So middle market companies, tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, the Fortune 500s are now taking a much more active role in measuring their carbon emissions and then participating in the various offset markets to reduce their emissions.
So is somebody doing an audit that tries to calculate bottoms up or in some way how much carbon a given company is responsible for based on, okay, well, you have this many factories and you're shipping stuff around and you have this much electricity use from your data center. So who is doing those audits and how do they go about them?
Yeah, I mean, there's a large group of companies ranging from, the big five consultants down to folks like myself who do GHG or greenhouse gas inventories for companies. And those inventories can be very tightly focused, so maybe just on a company's direct emissions from the fuels that they burn and the electricity they buy, or they could be very broad investigations that look, as you said, all the way down the supply chain through their logistics providers to their source materials, and then even all the way out to how customers might be using their products and how those products create emissions. And that kind of study is often called a life cycle analysis study. So there are a large number of firms. Again, most of the big companies are engaged and are performing those inventories annually. But a lot of smaller companies have not yet started to measure their inventory and are just now being asked by their customers, by their other B2B customers, to start supplying those numbers.
It would seem that some industries are just naturally, you're going to be creating more carbon than other industries. And do companies typically kind of get ranked against their peers? I mean, it would seem that, like an aluminum company that uses so much electricity, or an airline that, it would be unfair to rank them against something that is, kind of much lower use in carbon. So how does that happen?
Yeah, they do. So there are industry comparisons and industry benchmarks that are done, but they're also just broad-based. Who's the best in the Fortune 500s? Who's the best in certain regions, regardless of industry? So a lot of the leaders in this space are the tech industries. So folks like Microsoft, Google, even Amazon to some extent, Apple. So they've been very active in that space. But again, a lot of the more dirtier industries are following. Airlines have become very active. And again, what we see a lot of times is these companies start with an aspirational public goal. So the CEO will come out and say, we want to be carbon neutral or have a reduced environmental footprint. And then the tactics start to come after that. How do we achieve it? What programs we want to be involved in? And again, right now, there are a lot of activities that we have not figured out how to do without emitting carbon. So that's where these offsets come in. And, we haven't really figured out a good way to make steel or aluminum yet without emitting carbon. We haven't figured out a good way to fly an airplane without emitting carbon. So those companies are very active, in the offset markets because they really cannot meet their goals. And then for other companies, they may make huge emissions reductions, but it's that last little bit that they need, where it just becomes either completely uneconomical, or just really, really difficult to get rid of that last little bit of carbon. And so that's when they use an offset.
So, okay. So it sounds like companies are partly doing this voluntarily, or just for their image, or for some customers who may make buying decisions based on it. So let's say the company now, you tell me, anywhere in the U.S. wants to buy some carbon offsets because they've already tried to reduce their own carbon emissions. What are the different choices? Is there sort of one just global market, like you can just buy, you could just buy gold, kind of, there's a global price for it?
Yeah.
Or is there like lots of different fragmented markets with different interpretations of what a carbon offset is, and different levels of how tightly vetted and audited they really are? So
Yeah, it's definitely the latter, and it is a commodity that's not yet really been commoditized. So there are just lots of different products in the space. So, if a company is most companies that I work with, who are really just approaching and getting into this space and looking to maybe procure carbon offsets, or maybe put in solar or wind farms at their facilities because they have the ability to do that, and they want to generate revenue through participation in the carbon offset market. Most of them are focused on renewable energy, and that is probably the most commoditized and the most obviously certifiable type of offset. I mean, there's an electric meter that tells you exactly how much renewable energy you produced, and there's a protocol and a number of certification agencies at either the state level, and there's some national and global ones. Probably the most noted is one called Green-E, Green-E, and they provide both a national certification and then an international certification for renewable energy credits. Other programs have different degrees, so we're seeing a lot of movement agricultural-based credits, and in fact, there are some bills sitting in Washington right now that actually have some bipartisan support that could actually create some government voluntary programs around agricultural offsets, where farmers are performing activities to sequester carbon in the soil, and then that sequestration gets modeled and measured and then monetized, and those credits are sold. So again, wide variety of opportunities, for companies looking to purchase it. And again, if your stakeholders or your company is looking for very specific, either geographic type of offset, the more specific of an offset you get, the smaller part of the market you're approaching, and the prices tend to be higher. If you're just looking to offset your carbon in general, then you can use renewable electricity and get a pretty commoditized and pretty, at least right now, low cost credit.
Okay. So what if a company is doing business today, status quo X, and they're able to say, hey, we got more efficient at how we operate, and next year we can do this at 0.9x or 0.8x. So they're doing the same thing. Maybe they're producing aluminum, or maybe they're running a data center, but they reduce their amount of energy usage for the same task. Do you get a credit for that?
There are some programs that allow you to generate credits off of energy efficiency. They're pretty limited, and they have a lot of rules. There's a concept in the space called additionality, which is a made-up word that's part of the kind of global construct around how we think about carbon. And one of the tenets of additionality is if you're doing it because you're just going to make more money anyway, they really don't want to issue a credit for that. Where they want to issue credits is where people are not economically incented to do the right thing, and so the credit creates the economic incentive to change the activity. So again, there are some cases where you can do offset crediting projects through energy efficiency. I know for example, the state of New York doesn't really issue credits, but they have a lot of programs that help people move into more energy efficient lighting, more energy efficient motors, the use of variable frequency drives and process control. But it's not really a fungible offset that gets created for that.
I mean, it seems that, solar power is great and everything, but you still have to, consume resources to go put up the solar panels and everything. It seems like it would be almost better just to not use the energy in the first place.
That is, and we look at, I think a lot of, I refer to it oftentimes as a hierarchy of good. And if you look at kind of the most good that you can do is to not consume, right? It is to not use the electricity, not generate waste, not use a raw material. But that obviously has limitations, because, we also want to improve the quality of life for humankind. So, we want the internet, and we want quality food on our tables, and we want solidly constructed homes and things like that. So you can only get so efficient. And then kind of that next tier is, okay, what can we do very directly within our own confines to create some type of circular or positive approach? And so typically that's on-site renewable energy generation. So putting up solar panels, right? That's kind of the next level of good. And then as you get farther and farther down the road, kind of the last resort, the weapon of last resort, is really a carbon offset. Because ultimately, hopefully in 100 years, for example, we won't need offsets, right? Everything will be carbon neutral or sequestering carbon, and there'll be no need to have this marketplace where people are trading their emissions.
Tell me a bit about the types of projects that your firm does.
Yeah, so a lot of them are in renewables. A lot of them are in New Jersey right now. We talked about it before. The solar market there is very hot. Um, we do a lot of what we call offsite solar project contracting, so helping customers go out and um, directly purchase renewable energy from a new project, typically part of a new project that's going up. So this may be a huge wind farm in Texas or Iowa or something like that. And then one of the areas that we're really getting more involved in is in what we call Scope 1 offsets. So these are where we're actually helping customers reach out and either generate or buy credits from activities that are directly sequestering carbon. And a lot of that right now is soil carbon. That's really a lot of new science has come out there, and it's really a hot area right now for how do we turn our vast agricultural resources into carbon sinks, places where we can store carbon, instead of, kind of how we operated them historically, where, or at least recently historically, where they are producing a lot more carbon than they are sequestering.
Explain that to me a little bit. So I would have thought if you're growing some trees, then those are carbon sinks. If you are, taking crops and maybe you bury them, and so they don't, carbon gets back in the soil. But what's the science around this, and how is oil, the soil capturing carbon? Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So what you have to think about is you want to give the soil the ability to operate, like it did since before humans were messing with it. And so what you basically have is you want to create a process where the top layer of humus, where the actual either manure from grazing animals or materials like the vegetable materials that are on top, that they have the opportunity and the processes to be buried to capture that carbon that's in them, and then to slowly mix it down through the stratification of the soil through the natural processes of water and root growth. So a lot of the things are around how you actually manage the soil. So if you're doing agricultural and you're doing cropland, for example, you really want to avoid tilling, because tilling, mixes that bottom soil back up to the top, exposes it to the atmosphere, exposes it to weather, and then you actually are losing the ability to store the nutrients that you just put in. And that's why farmers use fertilizer and other things, which often made with petroleum products, definitely moved over large distances. So they have quite a high carbon footprint. So in the grazing areas, we're seeing a lot of motion to kind of go back to natural style grazing, and then looking at everything from the types of animals and the quantity of animals and the density of the animals and the duration of the animals on a specific pasture, as well as the type of grasses that you're growing there. And really, a return to history, a return to going back to natural grasses. One of the guys I work with described it great. I mean, you have to think about it like the wildebeest migration in Africa. That is a thousands of years long activity, which is actually working with the grass and the land to sequester carbon through the activities of the wildebeest herd. So how do you repeat that in a dairy farm in Minnesota, right?
So farms would be, what sort of new different practices would they be doing?
Yeah, I mean, the whole concept around carbon farming, again, depending on what crop or agricultural product you're growing, a lot of it has to do with low till, no till. A lot of it has to do with even organic farming, where you're removing the additions, particularly the non-natural additions to the soil. When it comes to animals, we look at process called rotational grazing or adaptive multi-paddock grazing. Again, how you're controlling the animals on the space to maximize their ability to do the thing that actually sequesters the carbon.
What sort of clients are engaging you on this? Is it like large corporate farms? Is it sort of, are the farmers actually then generating carbon credits that they can sell on the market?
Yeah. I mean, I would call them. I wouldn't call them small holding farms, but they're not the big. The big companies right now, are more involved with industrial agriculture, which is not really this style of agriculture. So it's kind of the medium-sized farms. A lot of them are already embracing the organic grass-fed movement or organic vegetable movement, organic crop movements. So they're really already a lot of the way there. And then there are new protocols from different certifying bodies that are allowing them to monetize those credits. And again, probably the recent example, I think in the past 4 weeks, Microsoft just bought a chunk of credits from a cattle farm in Australia that is again applying these rotational grazing tactics to sequester carbon in their soil.
And then, how does it actually get determined? So, what do these certifying agencies do? Do they go in and measure the soil before and after, and use measure the carbon content in a lab, or how do they go about this?
Yep, that's exactly what they do. They measure and model. So the measuring part is really exactly what it sounds. They drill a core sample down to the soil, usually to at least a depth of 30 centimeters. They look at the type of soil and the stratification layers of that soil, and then they test it to see how much carbon is actually in each layer. And then they work with the farmer to see which tactics the farmer is going to apply to increase the amount of soil carbon. And again, some tactics will be banned, like tilling may be banned for that protocol. Other tactics would be encouraged. And then that gets modeled, and the credits are issued off that model. And then there's an audit process, typically on a 5-year cycle, where there's remeasurement and testing to say, yep, we are seeing what we modeled, and the credits that we've issued are valid.
And talk to me about the economics a little bit. What order of magnitude? What sort of prices or compensation can a farm get for following through with this?
Yeah, this is one area where the markets are still very new. We know that, for example, and it's a little hard because we don't know the actual details of the deal, but the Microsoft deal that I mentioned earlier was for $500,000. Now, I think that I think in the 20,000 hectare ranch, $500,000 is a lot of money. The program being contemplated in DC right now is kicking around $20 a ton of carbon, which, think about what we talked about with renewable energy earlier. $20 a ton is pretty good. So I think a lot of it is if you have somebody looking to generate offsets into that space, because the market is really not fully commoditized yet. What I work with clients to do is to estimate what the costs are going to be, and then work with them to identify potential customers and see what those customers might pay for those offsets. A lot of times they're looking to create more of a luxury good than a standard good, right? That they want to advertise that they have, a carbon neutral menu. And by the way, that's coming, right? There will be, we have the diet fat-free option. There will be a carbon neutral option of menu items coming on chain restaurant menus in the next few years. So the ability for them to do that is going to obviously drive their desire and what amount they might pay for a product that is certified in that way. Or they might just need the offset, and it imports with their marketing program, and it's something they want to be associated with.
Why would a company pay $20 a ton for these carbon offsets from a farm if they can buy renewable carbon offsets for $1?
Yeah, that gets into the intricacies of something we call carbon accounting. And I know your audience as well as myself, right? We're all MBAs, and we understand the difference between accounting and finance. And accounting, I like to say accounting is great, but it doesn't make any sense. It's just a set of rules. And so when it comes to carbon accounting, your carbon is classified into different areas, and we call them scopes, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. And the scope 2, which is from your electrical or your purchased energy, is in the carbon accounting world only offsettable by credits, which are also generated through electricity. So you can use a solar credit to get rid of your scope 2, but you can't use a solar credit to get rid of your scope 1. Likewise, an agricultural credit could get rid of your scope 1 or your scope 3, but can't get rid of your scope 2. So it's a pretty wonky description there, but the companies that are really, particularly the big companies that are really reporting the emissions, to a CDP or there's a SBTI, which is the Science-Based Targets Initiative. There are a lot of rules on how they account for their carbon, and so everything needs to be in certain buckets. And so that's why a company might not be able to get a 50-cent credit and have to go to a $20 credit.
That seems odd. I mean, a ton of carbon in the atmosphere. The atmosphere doesn't care where it came from. What was the logic behind having this segmentation of different scopes?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is done that way to go back to that hierarchy of good approach and to really force people to be critical about how they remove carbon from their operations and not allow folks just an easy pathway out. Again, these are all designed around kind of the UN constructs of and the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, and then the breakdown of activities that they created and they look at is where we kind of get these scope calculations. And this is the same with that conversation we had a little bit earlier about additionality. These rules often don't make a lot of sense, and they can be frustrating for people trying to enter the market. It does make it look more and more like a black box, some crazy marketplace than one that's built on logic and common sense. But these are the rules that are at least in play right now until we get to an area where we see huge parts of those scopes eliminated. And frankly, we're getting that close to that in many countries, and even in some states where so much of electricity, for example, is produced through renewables that it's almost a moot conversation to talk about scope 2. And instead we are all focused on scope 1.
And what is scope 1, 2, and 3? You said 2 is the purchased energy. What is scope 1 and scope 3?
Energy. Yeah, 1 is the direct emissions, typically of things that you burn. Tailpipe emissions from your fleet of vehicles, for example. If you have if you're a FedEx or the Postal Service and you have all these trucks and cars, all the emissions associated with things that you're burning. If you're a food manufacturer, you are burning a lot of natural gas to make hot water for your food processes, for your cleaning processes. So all that direct combustion is scope 1. In the agricultural world, methane from your cows is scope 1. So that's kind of your direct emissions of greenhouse gases. And then scope 3 is your supply chain. So it's things where you don't have direct control over your emissions. So the classic example there is travel. The airline is going to fly the airplane whether you're on it or not. So you don't really have direct control over those emissions, but you do have some indirect influence because if you stopped flying, that would be a little bit less market demand. If everybody stopped flying, then the airplane wouldn't fly. So those are kind of the three classifications that we have.
So we're talking about the types of projects that you do. So, and I'm still confused by this scope thing. It just seems odd that they've set up the rules that way. You'd think that, say, like, let's get carbon out the most economical way possible. And I'd rather get 20 tons of carbon out if it's $1 a ton than 1 ton at $20 a ton. It just, I don't understand that piece. But we're talking about the projects, the types of projects you do. So one area is around soil. So you're working with, kind of mid-sized farms on that to help them, I guess, work with these accreditation agencies. How does the market actually work? Is it like a stock exchange kind of thing, or is it much more of a one-to-one buyer to seller negotiated agreement? How do you find buyers and sellers find each other?
Yeah, private transaction, and then there are some brokers that kind of run private markets. So you work with a broker, and a broker may be aggregating credits from multiple places and providing clients a portfolio of credits from different projects in different countries. And then they're creating their own little marketplace. There's a few companies like that that are doing that. Let's see, there's one called 3 Degrees. There's another one called Level 10. There's a few others as well. A lot of those are moving into blockchain regulated and monitored markets. There's a lot of movement in blockchain in terms of how you validate the markets and trace the carbon. And then again, there's a lot of just private transaction. So a lot of the big companies who are buying significant amounts of credits, they're going to do that through private transaction. Whether that's Google building or working with a supplier to build a 100 megawatt wind farm, or whether that's Microsoft going to a farm in Australia and buying credits from a farmer. So it's not a commoditized market. There is no real stock exchange style trading platform. Now there are some that are coming. So California and the CARB, California Air Resource Board, through one of their regulated markets on carbon, does have a more typical stock exchange approach, and you can buy futures and options and things like that. I wouldn't say that the volumes in that market are enough to truly have appropriate pricing yet, but it's a new market, a few years old, and it could get there.
Talk to me about the international market for carbon offset. Do markets highly differ country by country? Are there international exchanges where you can buy it from someone who is doing carbon sequestration or better soil management in another country? Talk to me about the whole international market.
Yeah, primarily European driven. And so what we see there is, Europe tends to have the buyers, and the offset generators tend to be in other countries, a lot of them in Africa, Latin America. Indonesia is a big space right now for offsets generated through forest preservation. So those markets, the EU is well known for its bureaucracy, and those markets are highly bureaucratic. There are in-country markets as well, particularly around renewable electricity, but those again tend to be more about utilities. Most end users right now, end users of electricity in Europe, are getting 100% renewable electricity through their utility provider without a need to go out and look for specific projects. So a lot of that regulation follows kind of the UN programs, OECI, and there's another one called CDM, which is the Clean Defense Mechanism, and that really establishes the types of projects that can be created, how they get formulated and created and certified, and then how those credits are exchanged, particularly when you're going country to country, because with the Paris Accord in particular, but even the predecessors to Paris and Kyoto and Rio, there are international treaties in place in terms of how countries have made promises to reduce their emissions, And we obviously don't want to say, okay, well, France can pollute all they want, but offset it with emissions reductions from Peru, because we have to think about what that does for the economics of both countries, not just the carbon. So, so this whole CDM is the way that countries exchange carbon offsets.
You mentioned Indonesia and forest preservation. How does that work? Is it something
Well,
around, well, we were going to cut down this forest and turn it into, make some, I don't know, grow soybeans or something here, but
yep,
we'll get a credit because we just won't cut it down. Even though we were going to. Like,
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Doesn't it seem strange, right? Um, and so the accreditation process for forest preservation is extremely difficult, and one, because, as you say, it seems so simple, and so anybody can say, well, I was going to cut that forest down, even though they weren't. And the second reason is that there was a lot of certification issues over the past couple decades, specifically with forest projects, where companies and countries said, "Hey, we planted 10,000 trees in the Amazon," and then somebody showed up in the Amazon where these trees were supposed to be, and they weren't there. So we're seeing a lot of strictness in terms of how those projects are certified, and one of the things you have to do is really prove to the accrediting agency that forest is really under threat. You have to have a guy standing there with a chainsaw, right? And then the second part of it that we're seeing, and this has been a huge area in satellite and GIS, is we're able now to monitor these forests in relatively real time. I'm working with one client. We're monitoring their forests for what we call incursion, and we actually provide a monthly satellite update on whether anybody's come in and cut any trees down. So those are the kind of the two methods, but your summary was exactly right. Is you're getting paid to not do something.
okay. Which is, so I can imagine there's all sorts of complexities around that.
Yeah.
Well, maybe they're just cutting down. I mean, and when they do that, is it protecting specific acres? Like, say, hey, this specific acre was going to get cut down, or because maybe the foresters go to cut some other acre down instead. It's kind of fungible.
Well, yeah, and there is a whole section of the protocol that specifically deals with that it's called leakage. And so that's exactly right. Well, okay, I didn't cut down this acre, but instead I cut down this other acre. Well, then it doesn't count, right? So you have to account for this leakage. If you're just shifting the problem to somewhere else, then you're not creating additional sequestration. So there's leakage, and then there's also another concept, which is called buffer pool, because there's things beyond anyone's control. So most notably in the Latin American countries and kind of middle America, one of the things we deal with is hurricanes, right? So you could be, in year 7 of a 20-year forest sequestration project, and a hurricane comes in and knocks the whole forest down. So we create these buffer pools, which basically sock away some of the carbon credits every year, so that in case there's a catastrophic, non-controllable event, we can pull out of the buffer pool to make sure that there are real credits.
Okay. This is a silly question, but for like paper manufacturing, right? They have forests where they're just planting trees to grow paper, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then when you cut the trees down, you make paper. The paper goes in a landfill, and you hear sometimes, oh, well, the paper never degrades in the landfill because it's buried. I mean, wouldn't that be a good thing? Isn't that kind of like carbon sequestration?
All right. I have not done the life cycle analysis like that on a piece of paper. So what I will say is that what a lot of the paper companies are doing is, instead of just protecting a forest, they're moving to forest management plans where they are able to sustainably take trees out of a forest without clear cutting the forest. And so one of the reasons that you release a lot of carbon when you can do slash and burn, clearing of forest land for agriculture in particular, but even if you do a clear cut for forestry purposes, is that you not only lose the carbon in the wood, but you're also losing the carbon in the soil that's been sequestered by the trees in below ground. You can think of like an iceberg, right? There's a lot of carbon stored in the tree below what you see. You tear this thing down, you expose it to the elements, you get erosion, all that carbon is going to come out. So, through forest management planning, they're able to do things where they're maintaining a forest, they're still able to economically harvest trees out of that forest, and keep that forest, kind of in a relatively carbon neutral state. And we're seeing projects like that. I know that one of the big pulp and paper companies is doing some stuff in Latin America, particularly growing eucalyptus. So types of tree matter, right? It's faster growing, it's good for paper, et cetera. In terms of the life cycle of you brought up about, well, can we sequester that carbon in a piece of paper? I mean, you probably could look at it that way. You have to kind of think about all the energy and everything else. And that probably blows away all of the storage in a single piece of paper. But this is why you get into these extremely complex analyses. And again, it's really hard to model some of these life cycle stories. So that's it's a good place for consultants to be. When things are hard, that's a good project for a consultant.
What was your path to become an expert and a consultant in this greenhouse gas space?
Yeah, I mean, the industry kind of grew up around me. I started out in industrial energy management, so working for these big companies who consumed massive amounts of electricity, and helping them just purely from an efficiency standpoint. How do we more efficiently operate these facilities? Because they had $200 million, $300 million line items for energy. So even 1% is a lot of money. So that's kind of where I started, and I moved through commercial and institutional space. We're helping those customers be more energy efficient as the technologies grow. And then the carbon conversation kind of grew around me. And it gave me the opportunity to kind of expand my thinking, move into renewable energy, participate in all these reporting and carbon offset schemes, because I was kind of living their initiation. And so again, when I kind of moved out on my own as my own consultant, I had a good knowledge base across all these things, and I had been both a supplier in that space, a consultant in that space, as well as a consumer when I worked for a Fortune 500 company, and I was buying these offsets for them. So kind of a long career that's allowed me to sit at every seat of the table, and I think that really helps me when I talk to customers now about the rationale of why they should do something or why they should avoid something.
And for listeners that wanted to follow up and learn more about your firm, where would you point them?
They can either reach out to me directly or through my firm on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest way. They can also reach out via my website. It's green-strategies.com. That's strategies plural. Or more than happy to reach out through you to me directly. And happy to have initial conversations with anybody that has a customer that may be interested in this or is asking questions, and maybe point them in the various right directions of what might be a good project for them.
Fantastic. So definitely reach out to Ali if you're curious to hear more about carbon sequestration. We obviously didn't even scratch the surface today.
No pun intended.
No pun intended. And for listeners, if you go to umbrex.com and click on the Unleash tab, you can sign up for the weekly email where you get a summary of all the recent episodes and some occasional bonus material. Thanks for listening.